The early 15th century, when Joan of Arc emerged, was one of the bloodiest and most turbulent periods in Europe. The Hundred Years' War, which had begun in 1337, was a long-lasting dynastic struggle between France and England. The main cause of the war was the claim of England's King Edward III to the French throne. When the last male heir of the Capetian dynasty in France died, Edward III of England asserted his right to the French throne through his mother, who was the daughter of King Philip IV of France. However, French nobles rejected this claim, arguing that the throne could not pass through the female line, and instead crowned Philip VI from the Valois dynasty, a cousin of the Capetians. This decision deepened the conflict between the two kingdoms and ignited the war. In the early stages of the war, the English achieved major victories. In battles such as the Battle of Crécy in 1346 and the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, the English army inflicted heavy defeats on the French. In 1415, King Henry V of England's famous victory at the Battle of Agincourt devastated the French nobility and paved the way for the English to occupy large parts of France. The Duchy of Burgundy also allied with the English, seeking to divide French territories. The war was not only between France and England, but also had the characteristics of a civil war within France itself. The French nobility was divided between the Burgundians and the Armagnacs. While the Burgundians supported the English, the Armagnacs sided with the Valois dynasty, the legitimate French monarchy. This internal conflict further weakened the French throne. In 1419, John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, was assassinated in Paris. This event further strengthened the Burgundian alliance with the English, leading to the loss of a significant portion of French territory. The Treaty of Troyes, signed in 1420, completely shifted the balance in favor of the English. According to this treaty, King Henry V of England was recognized as the heir to the French throne, effectively displacing the Valois dynasty. The rightful heir to the French throne, Charles, refused to accept this treaty and declared that he did not recognize it. However, his position was weak due to his father, King Charles VI's, deteriorating mental health and the Queen's alignment with the English. Paris and northern France had fallen under English and Burgundian control. As a result, Charles VII was forced to flee Paris and seek refuge in the southern city of Bourges. Bourges was one of the last strongholds under Charles' control, and from there, he continued to govern his kingdom. However, his authority was weak. Many French nobles questioned his legitimacy and supported the English. Moreover, with northern France entirely occupied by the English, it became impossible for Charles VII to hold the traditional coronation ceremony required for legitimacy. According to French tradition, a king had to be crowned in Reims Cathedral, but Reims was under the control of the English and the Burgundians. During this period, one of the most crucial stronghold cities keeping France from collapsing was Orléans. In 1428, the English laid siege to Orléans, aiming to capture it and completely crush the resistance of Charles VII. If Orléans fell, Charles' claim to the throne could come to an end, and England could fully assert its dominance over France. At this critical moment, Joan of Arc emerged. Although she was a young peasant girl, she claimed to have received messages from God, and that she had been chosen to save France. Encouraged by these visions, Joan approached the local commander in the town of Vaucouleurs, which was under the control of the Duchy of Burgundy. She insisted that she needed to meet with King Charles VII because God had given her a mission to save France. At first, she was ridiculed, but her determination gradually drew attention. In early 1429, Joan of Arc set out from Vaucouleurs to meet Charles VII in Chinon. In March 1429, Joan arrived at Charles VII's court in Chinon. However, the king and his advisors were skeptical that a young peasant girl could change the course of the war. To test her, they devised a trick. Joan had to identify the real Charles VII from a large crowd without knowing where he was. Joan walked directly to the true Charles VII and greeted him. This event was striking for the king and the nobles around him. However, doubts remained about Joan's reliability. To determine whether she was truly guided by God, she was interrogated by a group of theologians in Poitiers. The theologians concluded that Joan showed no signs of heresy in her religious beliefs and advised Charles VII that she might indeed help France. The king granted Joan permission to join his army and assigned her a military unit. Thus, Joan of Arc, once a simple peasant girl, suddenly became a leader within the French army. When Orléans was besieged by the English in October 1428, France's situation looked bleak. The English army controlled vast portions of northern and western France. Additionally, the Duchy of Burgundy was allied with the English, and France's internal divisions due to civil war further weakened the authority of Charles VII. The fall of Orléans would mean that the English could advance along the Loire River and completely collapse Charles VII's government in Bourges. If the city was lost, the small Valois territories remaining in southern France would inevitably fall under English occupation. Therefore, the defense of Orléans became the last hope of the French. In April 1429, with the approval of Charles VII, Joan of Arc set out for Orléans with a force of 4,000 men. This journey was not just a military operation, but also a psychological turning point. The people, believing Joan to be a messenger of God, regained their lost hope upon her arrival. As soon as she arrived in Orléans, Joan encouraged the guards and soldiers. Until that day, Charles VII and the French army had relied on a constant retreat strategy against the technological superiority and better trained soldiers of the English. However, Joan insisted that the French abandon their defensive stance and go on the offensive. At first, the commanders hesitated. Joan's youth and lack of military training made some nobles and generals skeptical of her. However, the morale of both the army and the people had fallen so low that Joan's mere presence became a source of motivation. She encouraged the French soldiers, declaring, "God is with us, we will win this war." With Joan of Arc's arrival, the French army abandoned its long-standing defensive strategy and launched an offensive. The fall of Orléans would mean France coming completely under English control. The French soldiers and commanders inside the city were making their last stand. However, Joan's arrival radically changed the course of the war. Her presence in Orléans was not only militarily, but also psychologically significant. The people and soldiers believed that a divinely chosen messenger had come to save them. While the French had long waged a passive defensive war, Joan ordered the first assaults. The initial target was the fortifications that enabled the English to maintain the Siege of Orléans. On May 4, 1429, Joan led an attack on the fortress of Saint-Lô and captured it. After a full day of fierce fighting, the French forced the English into their first retreat. This victory boosted the morale of the French army and began to shake the belief in English superiority. On May 5th, although Joan wanted to continue the battle, the attacks were paused for a day due to Holy Thursday. She and her soldiers offered their gratitude to God and prayed for victory. The next day, the assaults resumed. On May 6th, the fortresses of Saint-Jean-le-Blanc and Saint-Augustin were also captured. Losing their defensive positions along the river, the English began to retreat. For the first time in many years, the French had captured multiple English fortifications, gaining a decisive advantage over their opponents. However, the main battle took place on May 7th, 1429. A major assault was launched against Les Tourelles, the strongest English fortification in Orléans. This fortress was the most crucial English stronghold, maintaining the siege of Orléans. If it fell, the siege would be completely broken. Joan took the lead and encouraged her soldiers to attack. During the day-long battle, an arrow struck Joan in the shoulder, forcing her to be removed from the battlefield. However, despite her injury, she returned to the battlefield in the evening. Her reappearance gave the French soldiers a tremendous morale boost. The troops launched a final all-out assault and utterly defeated the English. With the fall of Les Tourelles, the siege of Orléans ended. The English were forced to retreat, and the gates of the city opened to French victory. This was not just a military triumph, but a turning point that shattered the long-standing despair of the French people, proving that France could rise again. Joan of Arc was no longer just a young girl. She was the hero of France. Following this great victory, Joan returned to Charles VII and urged him to take the next step. According to her, the liberation of France could only be completed if Charles VII declared his legitimacy. By tradition, a French king had to be consecrated in Reims Cathedral. However, Reims was under English and Burgundian control, and reaching the city was a significant risk. French generals and nobles warned Charles VII that a campaign to Reims was dangerous and that the English could launch a counterattack. But Joan was determined. She believed that God had sent her to crown the king, and she refused to retreat. Joan's persistence paid off, and Charles VII decided to march toward Reims. The French army moved northward, and along the way, cities began to surrender without resistance. The French people believed Joan had a divine mission and rallied behind her. When they reached Reims, the English withdrew without resistance, and the city fell into Charles VII's hands. On July 17, 1429, Charles was officially crowned King of France in Reims Cathedral. During the ceremony, Joan of Arc stood right beside him. She had successfully placed France's rightful ruler on the throne, and for her, this meant the completion of her sacred mission. Although Charles VII's coronation in Reims seemed to fulfill Joan of Arc's mission, the war was far from over. The English had not yet withdrawn entirely from France, and the Burgundians continued their alliance with them. Joan pressed Charles to continue the fight and liberate Paris as well. In her view, God's message was not limited to the coronation ceremony. France had to be completely free before the mission was truly fulfilled. However, the king and the nobles at his court had begun to feel uneasy about Joan's relentless desire to push forward. Paris was heavily guarded by the Burgundians and the English. Joan of Arc convinced Charles to attack the city, and in the autumn of 1429, the French army marched toward Paris. On September 8, 1429, a major assault was launched on the city. Joan of Arc fought directly on the front lines, leading her soldiers. However, the city's walls were incredibly strong, and the French encountered much fiercer resistance than expected. During the battle, Joan was wounded by an arrow, but she refused to retreat and remained on the battlefield. However, Charles ordered the attack to be halted, forcing the French army to withdraw. This was a great disappointment for Joan. The French king was now more open to negotiations with the English and sought diplomatic solutions to bring the war to an end. Joan, on the other hand, still believed that victory could only be achieved through continued fighting. During this period, Joan's influence at court began to decline. Charles VII's advisors believed that she had gained too much power and was becoming uncontrollable. As a peasant girl who had risen to become France's greatest hero, Joan's status was difficult for the nobility to accept. Many in the king's court did not want her interfering in politics and sought to limit her influence on military decisions. Despite this, Joan did not abandon her struggle. In May 1430, she set out to aid the city of Compiègne, which was under siege by the Burgundians. She led a small army to support the French resistance there. However, on May 23, 1430, she fell into a trap and was captured by the Burgundians. Joan of Arc's capture was a devastating blow to the French. However, the greatest disappointment was for Joan herself. She believed that Charles VII would take action to rescue her. But this did not happen. The French king and the nobles made no attempt to save Joan. She had become a political burden for the monarchy, and the court preferred to forget her. The Burgundians sold Joan to the English for 10,000 livres. The English saw her not just as a military leader, but as a political and religious threat. Joan's victories had weakened English authority over France, and they wanted to prevent her from being remembered as a hero. For this reason, they decided to try her not as a prisoner of war, but as a heretic and a witch. In early 1431, Joan was taken to Rouen, where she was put on trial by a pro-English court. The trial was entirely controlled by the English, and her conviction was predetermined. One of the main charges against her was her claim of receiving divine visions. In the Middle Ages, it was considered dangerous for women to claim religious authority, and Joan's assertion that she communicated directly with God was deemed heresy by the Church. During the trial, Joan was subjected to intense questioning, with the goal of trapping her in contradictions. However, she remained steadfast and gave such intelligent responses that the judges struggled to convict her. Nevertheless, one of the main charges against her was her wearing of male clothing and her defiance of church authority. In the end, Joan of Arc was convicted of heresy and sentenced to death. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was publicly burned at the stake in Rouen. Many in the crowd were shocked by her bravery and innocence. The English had hoped to erase her influence over the people, but her death had the opposite effect. It became a source of inspiration for the French. Before her death, Joan prayed one last time and reaffirmed her devotion to God. As the flames rose, she was said to have cried out, "Jesus." Her body was completely burnt to prevent her from being honored as a saint, and her ashes were thrown into the Seine River. The English believed they had erased her memory, but this was not the case. About 25 years after Joan of Arc's death, in 1456, Charles VII ordered a review of her trial. Investigations concluded that the court had been unjust, and Joan was declared innocent. Her reputation was officially restored, and her execution was acknowledged as a great injustice. However, Joan's true victory came when she became a national hero of France. In the 19th century, with the rise of French nationalism, her story was revived as a symbol of courage and divine faith in France's independence. In 1920, the Catholic Church officially canonized her as a saint, and today she remains one of France's most revered national figures.